Okay, so first the ancestors. Augustine famously has an argument for God from eternal truth, which the basic idea is that truth resides in a mind, or truth must reside in a mind, but there are eternal necessary truths, so there must be an eternal necessary mind in which those truths reside. Leibniz has a somewhat similar argument, some slight variation there, but that's the basic idea. And so here's the first pass version of the contemporary argument. So the first premise, there are propositions. Propositions are thoughts. If propositions are thoughts, then they're divine thoughts or human thoughts. So either they're divine thoughts or human thoughts, but they're not human thoughts, so they're divine thoughts. And if they're divine thoughts, then there's a unique divine thinker. So there's a unique divine thinker. It's obviously a formally valid argument, but lots of things to question in there. So first, there's some problems that I want to note and then just kind of set aside. So premise 3, that if propositions are thoughts, then they're all human thoughts or all divine thoughts, which gets us to derive that they're either all human thoughts or all divine thoughts. Well, you might think, well, are these options exhaustives? Maybe there's possible bionic people or aliens or something like that. Well, I'm not going to worry about that. I just don't think that's inherently plausible. And then you might think there's a hybrid view where some propositions are human thoughts and some are divine. And I think maybe some medieval philosophers had a view like this, but that really doesn't affect the argument, because as long as there are some divine thoughts, you get the divine thinker. And then, of course, premise 7, that the divine thoughts entail a unique divine thinker. Well, you might think, well, why not a posse of divine thinkers instead of a unique divine thinker? Leibniz dealt with a similar objection to his argument. He answers it by invoking a rather radical theory of relations, but you might just think a simple appeal to Occam's razor works here. So I'm not going to really worry about that either. And then finally, the conclusion. You might worry that, as with many of the other arguments, it doesn't quite get you the God of classical theism, gets you something like an infinite intellect or an omniscient intellect or something like that. But we may need to move from Aquinas' 5 ways to Al's 24 ways to get all the different properties we need. So today I'm going to focus on 2 particular premises of the argument. The premise 2, that propositions are thoughts. So almost no propositionalist post-Frege really finds this convincing. But recently there's been a change. Philosophers of language who are prominent propositionalists, such as Scott Soames, Peter Hanks, and Jeff King, are all arguing for something like 2. It's more sophisticated than just the statement that propositions are thoughts, but we'll see exactly how that works. And they claim to be offering naturalistic theories of propositions. So we'll look at arguments for that below. And then, of course, there's premise 5, that propositions are not human thoughts. So propositional naturalists argue for 2, but obviously would reject 5. And by their lights, if something like 5 were right, it would be, just a reductio of their view. So this is an example of where one person's modus tollens is another person's modus ponens. So obviously you can go the one direction and say, if propositions are thoughts, they must be divine thoughts, but they can't be divine thoughts, so that view can't be right. And in the other direction, propositions are thoughts. If they're thoughts, they must be divine thoughts, and they are thoughts, because you find that convincing, and so then you got an argument for something like God. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about premise 2, and as I said, most propositionalists reject it, mainly because of Frege's anti-psychologistic arguments, which I won't rehearse here. But just quickly note that theist propositionalists who reject 2 have to deal with a threat to divine aseity from abstract objects. So, this gets into a complicated debate, but just let's suffice it to note that theist propositionalists have some motivation to be friendly to premise 2. And from an entirely different direction, people who are interested in naturalizing propositions argue for something like 2. So we're going to look at their views now, or one particular view. But before we do that, I want to set up some preliminaries and establish some terminology. So just to quickly remind ourselves what propositions are, what we want them to do. Well, propositions are circumscribed by their roles. So they're fundamentally, they're the primary bearers of truth and falsity, possible contents of belief and other attitudes. Others would add semantic values of sentences in context of utterance, or what's asserted in context of utterance, and then whatever's entailed by these roles. And how do they do this? Well, as Alvin Plantinga nicely put it, propositions are claims or assertions. They attribute or predicate properties to or of objects. They represent reality or some part of it as having a certain character. And as Michael Jubian puts it, the essence of a proposition is to represent. So I just want to establish some terminology here because, representation's a really broad category and lots of things can be said to represent in various ways. So, maps represent, pictures represent. You might even say that, somebody's reflection in a pool of water represents them. But a proper subset of things that represent also have truth conditions. And so we're going to focus our attention on that kind of representation, and I'm going to call it truth after representation, and put a little subscript T after represent and its cognates to indicate that that's the kind of representation I'm talking about. So sentences, beliefs, things like that would all be types of entities that represent in such a way that they determine truth conditions and so can take a truth value. And so just because it's a little awkward to be shifting away from the intentionality vocabulary, just want to quickly point out that the way I'm using representation, I'm going to assume that anything that represents has intentionality. I'm not going to assume the converse because there's some naturalistic conceptions of intentionality that I think are actually in tension with that. So we're going to be talking mainly about representation. Sometimes we'll use it interchangeably with intentionality, but just to be careful about what that means. Okay, so one further distinction would be between something representing derivatively or fundamentally. So definitions there. So if X derivatively represents Y, again, it's a truth after representation there. If and only if there's some Z distinct from X, such that X is representing Y is due to Z is representing Y. And we put that as X represents Y in virtue of Z representing Y. And then fundamental representation is just non-derivative. And so the classical example of that would be that, a sentence represents and has truth conditions not fundamentally, but derivatively because of the proposition it expresses. So that brings us to the traditional conception of propositions that we've inherited from Frege and the other analytic forebears. So the propositions represent fundamentally, independent of minds and languages. Other truth bearers, such as belief states, sentences, etc., represent derivatively in virtue of their relation to propositions. Then on the recent view known as propositional naturalism, we have that propositions represent because agents represent. So agents are the fundamental representers. And Scott Soames, Peter Hanks, Jeff King, and actually most philosophers before Bolzano and Frege would have held something like this. So what is their reason for rejecting this traditional conception of propositions? Well, I think Michael Jubian actually summarizes it quite nicely, so I'm going to quote him. So Jubian says, quote, "It's implausible to think any genuine Platonic entity could represent on its own cuff. It borders on the absurd to suppose that any inert, non-spatiotemporal entity could have a part that in itself plays any referential or quasi-referential role. Representation is ultimately the business of beings with intentional capacities, in short, thinkers." And so when he's talking about parts representing there, he's thinking of the structure propositions paradigm. I tried to sort of flesh this intuition out into an argument. I am not so sure the argument is good, but basically, here's roughly how it goes. So if X represents Y fundamentally, This is either due to some causal relation obtaining between x and y, as in photos, reflections, etc., or some active power of x is to be about or directed on y, which would be if it's a thought or a concept or something like that. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations and have no active powers by definition. So abstract objects don't represent fundamentally. So traditionally conceived propositions don't exist because they're, by definition, abstract objects that represent fundamentally. And like I said, I'm worried about this argument. I'm going to skip this slide there. I really think, it just comes down to this premise here, an intuition about what it is to represent fundamentally. And, I talked to Al about it earlier today, actually, and so I think this is one of those things where it's just going to come down to brute metaphysical intuition. Like, some people find this plausible, some people don't. And so if you find this kind of thing plausible, then you can come along the ride for the argument, for the theistic argument from intentionality. And if you don't, you can stick in the traditional propositionalist camp. I'm actually not even sure where I fall. I think I'm more inclined to be a traditional propositionalist right now. Sorry if that it's a little depressing for the argument. But I just think it's kind of, I'm not exactly sure, and I'd be happy to hear suggestions from people about this, but I'm just not exactly sure how you argue for the claim. But lots of people, philosophers like Jeff King, Scott Soames, Peter Hanks, other prominent propositionalists are being convinced that, they're re-examining the traditional view and saying, look, why did anybody ever think this made any sense? It doesn't. And what they ultimately want to do as naturalists is explain propositional representation. And they think they can do this by making it depend on agent representation. The prospects might not be as great for explanation if you bring God in the picture. So suppose you are convinced of the argument against traditional propositions and you think that there are propositions, but the representation is ultimately the business of agents, it's ultimately the business of thinkers. Well, what are your options? Well, basically, some sort of propositional naturalism, where the mental ground for truth, small g there, I'm not invoking Kit Fine or anything, is the human mind, or something like a divine thought theory, that God's mind, or at least an infinite mind, is the mental ground for truth. And I don't think there are any other options, but if you guys come up with any, you can let me know. So just to fix ideas, we're going to focus on one particular version of the propositional naturalist view, which is the version of Scott Soames that's been pretty influential. So Scott Soames has this theory of what he calls cognitive propositions. And according to Soames, propositions are purely representational, repeatable cognitive acts. And obviously there are lots of different cognitive acts that we can perform that are representational. There's all different kinds of propositional attitudes, but he's got one fundamental ingredient in all the attitudes, that's entertaining, which he defines as predicating a property. So S entertains the proposition that A is F, if and only if S predicates F of A, if and only if S represents A as being F. And he means this in a technical sense. It doesn't mean you actually are thinking consciously about predicating property when you do it. And this is the ingredient in all the propositional attitudes like judgment and desire and what have you. So you might think, well, how does this work exactly? Because he can't really be talking about token cognitive acts. That would be obviously problematic right from the get-go. Well, he identifies propositions with cognitive act types and says that agents represent in a primary sense by predicating properties of objects, but cognitive act types, which he identifies with propositions, represent in an extended or derivative sense. So the act type / proposition that B is read represents B as being read in a derivative sense because every possible token act in which an agent predicates readness of B is one in which an agent represents B as being read in a primary sense. So you might think initially that you can see that there's a problem. So I'm going to call this a problem of scarcity. So a theory of propositions T as a problem of scarcity if there are propositions for which T cannot account. Classic example of this would be Russell's initial formulation in 1903 of propositions as sorts of facts, which he had to revise because he couldn't generate false propositions that way, which is pretty obviously a problem. So it might seem obvious that Soames' theory of cognitive propositions has this problem, because just consider the propositions that nobody ever entertains. It looks like his theory entails that there are no such propositions. So, bam, what are we done? Is this it? Is it that easy? Well, somebody like Scott Soames has obviously thought very hard about this and has thought about cases like this and has a response. So what Soames does is appeal to systematicity here. So he says, look, propositions that aren't entertained in a world W could still exist in W if their constituents are cognized in W. So cognized is his world for whatever sort of cognitive sort of contact we have to have with the constituents of a proposition to entertain it. So notice this is a sufficient condition if any n-place property R and objects O1 through On are cognized in W, then this suffices for the existence in W of propositions composed out of R and O1 through On. So then you might think, okay, well, what about propositions with never cognized constituents? How does he deal with those propositions? So consider, for example, some molecule M that's never cognized in a world W, and the singular proposition that M is a molecule. Well, won't his theory entail that this proposition doesn't exist in that world? So his reply here is that really what we're interested in is truth, and propositions need not actually exist in a world W in order to be true. It's enough that they are possible with respect to W. So yes, the proposition that M is a molecule doesn't exist in W, but it's still true there. He also has to respond to a problem of, what about really large numbers that we can't grasp, that none of us could grasp, no naturalistically acceptable being could grasp. And for those, he also will appeal to the systematicity of numeral systems. So Jeff Speaks presses an objection like this against him, and he says, oh, well, there's a systematic linguistic system for representing all the numbers, and we've, as a result of mastery of the system, so basically you've got the basic stock of expressions, and we've accounted for the representational power of that basic stock, and so we can account for the representation of all the numbers that way. So you might immediately be thinking, what about serious actualism, which is just the view that necessarily no object has a property in a world in which it does not exist. So, of course, on serious actualism, no propositions have the property of being true in worlds in which they don't exist. Well, Soames is not an actualist, so he's also not a serious actualist. And this is almost a direct quote from his book. That's his response that serious actualism sucks. That I paraphrased just a little bit. So one way you could look at this is here's a place to get off the boat of, cognitive propositions. But another way you could look at it is, here's an interesting challenge. Let's see if we can still argue against cognitive propositions, even shelving our serious actualism. So, because I think actually that, we can argue with Soames on his own terms, and I think we can still show that his theory is not up to the task of accounting for all the propositions, even if we grant all the things that he's asked us to grant so far. I think the systematicity thing is also seriously worrisome, and I think he could be pressed on that point, but just one thing at a time. So what about propositions nobody entertains, or I should have said no finite being? No finite mind entertains in any possible world. So is it plausible to think there are such propositions? Is it a strike against a theory if it rules them out? And what sorts of possible agents do we have in mind here? Like, what about bionic people or possible aliens? Since we're like possibilists now, let's just open the gates and let in all kinds of weird beings. So there's an intuition that I'm going to call Hamlet's thesis, that there are truths that it's impossible for finite agents to entertain, that there are going to be truths that are way too complex for any mind of finite capacity to grasp, in the spirit of Hamlet's famous words to Horatio. And obviously, if we could establish something like that thesis, we could show that the cognitive propositions theories is false because it's obviously in conflict with it. For suppose there's some truth P that no finite agent in any possible world entertains. Well, how would CP account for P's truth in alpha? If there's no world possible with respect to alpha in which a finite agent entertains P, then it can't. And CP obviously can't appeal to an infinite agent because this would conflict with its naturalistic motivation. So can we come up with an example like that? Well, it's hard to talk about stuff it's impossible for us to grasp. How do we do that? Well, I don't know. You can be the judge of whether I succeed or not with my example. So I can't give an example, but I can describe one. And my example is singular propositions about choice sets. So consider the axiom of choice. Given any collection of mutually disjoint non-empty sets, there's a choice set containing exactly one element from each member of the collection. Could also put it in terms of choice functions. And I'm assuming a classic non-constructive reading of choice because I think that's fair game in this dialectical context, and I know that that's the reading that Soames would want to assume. So just kind of an intuitive illustration of the axiom. Let's think about like that air mix machine used in the Powerball lottery, and suppose we take some subset of real numbers, and we stick it into the, stick all those balls into the machine, and we pull one out, and we put it in that cup over there. Then we, empty it, take a different, a disjoint subset, put that in the machine, let it, mix all the balls around, pull one out, add that to the cup, and so suppose we do this like infinitely many times, then we've got a choice set. But I'm going to try to argue that, singular propositions about choice sets are things that we can't, finite beings can't grasp. So, okay, there we go. So first, just some conditions on entertaining singular propositions about sets. So take a singular proposition about a set S. The proposition S is a set, for example. This always makes me nervous whenever I write any necessary and sufficient conditions on the board because there's always like some wise ass who's going to come up with a counterexample. So, but whatever, just take the risk here. So A is in a position to entertain a singular proposition about a set S if and only if A satisfies at least one of the following three conditions. A cognizes all the members of S, which is obviously what we do works pretty well with relatively small finite sets. A cognizes a rule that generates all and only the members of S recursively from a finite base. We've got some small set of natural numbers in the successor function. Or A cognizes a predicate under which all and only the members of S fall. So we understand the predicate prime number, even though we don't know what all the prime numbers are, that we can grasp the proposition that there's about the set of primes. So here's the claim. So there are true propositions of set theory that neither we nor any finite agents could grasp. So call the sets that the axiom of choice is needed to generate choice-only sets. Notice that these sets will be finite. Notice these sets will be infinite. So the claim is that no possible finite agent entertains singular propositions about choice-only sets. I'm putting this in this possibilist vocabulary, but can be translated into a non-possibilist vocabulary. So it's necessary to satisfy at least one of the conditions to cognize a choice-only set, the conditions that were listed on the previous thing. But no possible finite agent satisfies any of the conditions with respect to these sets. We can't, list out all we can't cognize all the members. We don't know a function that would that we can apply. We can't define or specify a function that we can apply to a finite subset, and we we can't pick them out using predicates. A predicate that under which all and only the members of the sets fall. So no possible finite agent cognizes these sets, and then if no possible finite agent cognizes the choice-only sets, then no possible finite agent entertains singular propositions about them by pretty weak condition on entertaining singular propositions. So no possible finite agent entertains singular propositions about the choice-only sets. So recall that on Soames's view, possible representation is required for truth. but that requires being entertained by an at least possible agent. And since no possible finite agent entertains the choice propositions they don't represent on that view, so not only do they not exist, they're not true in any world state. So then here's the argument. Assume for reductio that the cognitive proposition theory is true. The choice propositions are true in alpha by math, but the choice propositions are not entertained by any finite agent, any possible world, if the previous argument's any good. But it's false that the choice propositions are true in alpha from CP and number 3 there. So by reductio ad absurdum, CP is false. However, if there were an infinite agent, that agent could, now I'm a little bit more worried about this given some of the discussion yesterday, but so if there were an infinite agent, it could arguably cognize the sets with uncountably many members, such that there's no recursive rule or finitely graspable predicate, under which all and only the members of such sets fall by cognizing all the members of those sets. Now, Soames obviously doesn't want to appeal to an infinite agent because this would conflict with his naturalistic motivation. But for those of us who don't have that naturalistic scruple, we can go back to the theistic argument from intentionality. So here's the revised theistic argument from intentionality. Propositions represent in a truth-apt way what only minds and their acts or states fundamentally represent. Thus, propositions are or depend on mental acts or states. There are true propositions that it's impossible for any finite agent to entertain. Thus, and the choice propositions about choice-only sets are supposed to be an example of that. Thus, the truth-apt representation of propositions is independent of the mental acts or states of finite agents. So propositions can't be or depend on the mental acts or states of finite agents. So propositions are or depend on the mental acts or states of an infinite agent. So there's an infinite agent. So that's the revised argument. And like I said, it doesn't quite get you to classical theism, but it's one of the 24 ways. Thanks.
Can I just say that was exactly the sort of thing that we wanted out of this conference? I mean, just exactly the sort of thing. That was absolutely fantastic. Let's see, Chris?
So this is just a comment, and I don't think it really affects the argument, but I think it needs to be revised a little bit because there really isn't anything, there really aren't such things as choice-only sets, right? I mean, choice is a principle that lets us say that a certain set exists and kind of lets us get our hands on it. But it seems to me you could make the argument simpler just by giving sort of an example of that. So you consider Zermelo's proof of the well-ordering theorem, at least the way it's usually presented. We just say, we've got, say, the set of reals. Let's say we prove that the reals are well-ordered. We have the set of reals. You consider the power set minus the empty set. Choice gives us, the second version of choice you gave us, gives us a choice function. And so now we can reason. So it just says there is such a set. Now, the way we usually conceive set theory, we're not saying, well, that set has come to be somehow. It's a choice-only set. It's that the axiom tells us that there is such a set, and now we can reason about it. And so maybe that's the set you could say you could just have that as kind of an example of, you know, one of these sets that we can now reason about that, right? Even though we can't say what exactly the value.
Exactly which set it is.
Yeah, exactly what the values of that choice function is going to be on that set.
Good. So I had some further commentary about what I meant by using that terminology that I was worried about time that I didn't get into. But basically, the reason I was saying choice-only sets is I wanted to single out sets that we need the axiom of choice to get.
Like that
and I know it's equivalent to Zorn's lemma and the well-ordering principle and stuff like that. But because, you know, like the Russell example of the shoes, you know, the millionaire with the infinite pairs of shoes, the infinite pairs of socks. Well, you know, you can use choice to get the a choice set from all the pairs of shoes, but like you don't really need choice because you can specify like pick every left shoe or pick every right shoe, right?
Right.
So, and that would be a set we could cognize, right? Because we would be able to define a function, that picked out all the members of the set, of all the members from that would form.
But what about this example, an example of the sort that I just gave, and we have a very large set, right? Power set of the reals minus the empty set, and now a choice function on that. I mean, we can't really cognize that set. Oh, sorry. We can't. I was going to give it back to you, but I guess I'm still talking.
So you're saying that's a set we could get in another. So I was trying to distinguish.
We can't cognize it in the sense of run through the values of the choice function on that set because it's massively huge, but it gives us a set that we can reason about in the context of the proof.
Right. So you're saying that would not, by the way I've defined a choice-only set as something we need the axiom of choice to get, and we can't get another way. That doesn't satisfy.
My
that
choice is
definition?
more worried that the idea of there being a class of choice-only sets. It's
Okay.
not really a well-defined notion, right? I mean, it doesn't really pick out a class of sets. So I'm just wondering if the argument would be clearer if we just sort of gave a concrete example of a clearly uncognizable set that's yielded by the axiom of choice.
Okay, so yeah, maybe I need to. I mean, let's talk about that later because.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Josh, I just sort of pass it around this table.
I really enjoyed your talk. So here's an idea of maybe to help with the premise too. I'm just kind of wondering about, which goes like this. On the view that you have all these propositions, and it's a kind of naturalistic view, you might think that propositions that exist sort of automatically exist, and maybe even that any ones that could exist just exist. And if you think this, then you can run into certain familiar Cantorian paradoxes. For example, you might think that for any x's, there is the proposition that those x's exist. And if you accept that premise, then you're going to get propositions like a proposition that's about all and only those propositions that aren't about themselves, and this leads to a familiar contradiction. Whereas on the infinite cognizer model, it takes a cognitive act, right, to form the proposition about those x's, so you don't automatically
Okay.
get all the, so maybe a way to motivate that second premise.
I'm happy for any ways to motivate that second row. So yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
I'm taking it away from that table temporarily. Todd Bierce is meeting me halfway again.
I didn't sit at the grown-ups table. I wanted to raise a question to premise 2 of the revised argument, or I guess it was in the original argument as well, and just see how the cognitive propositionalist approach is supposed to answer it. So the question is something like this. Do the rings of a tree represent its age?
Do the rings of a tree represent its age? Well, I don't. That's a good question. Do the rings of a tree? So, by looking at the rings of a tree, we can determine its age. But yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. And if it did, would that be? So you're saying that it would be representing in a way that had a truth value because it would be saying the tree is. I mean, it seems like it would be kind of implausible to think that it. So it carries information about the age of the tree. So
Yeah, that's what I assume the approach would have to say, but I suspect that at least one program in naturalistic accounts of intentionality is to say, no, that's bona fide, representational.
So like a Dretske kind of
Yeah.
indicator
Right.
view, yeah.
So I was just seeing what you would do with it, but it sounds like you'll say that's not really representing, that's like proto-representing or information-bearing.
Well, so I think, they're focused on a certain kind of representation, but I'm a little bit worried that the way I defined it, so I don't know exactly how to think about the example. So is it,
Yeah.
is the tree ring representing in a way that determines truth conditions? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I have to think about it. Because if it is, then I think that seems like that would be a problem, because it's obviously like there's no cognitive act involved there.
Alex Bruce?
Okay, a constructive and a destructive comment. The constructive comment is here's a reason to think the premise 2 is true. There are many kinds of representation. True fact representation is only one kind of it. Propositions do only one of those kinds. So if we take propositions to be fundamental representers, if we take the abstract propositions to be fundamental representers, we're going to have many different kinds of fundamental representers. But we take minds and their acts to be fundamental representers. They might be the same fundamental representatives for all the different kinds of fundamental representations, so we get parsimony.
Oh, do you want me to answer that first? Or
He got muted when he grabbed it, so I wanted to turn it on.
do you want me to answer that first before you go to the next
If you
one?
like.
Yeah, well, sort of based on what Todd was saying, but also, I thought I gave some examples too. I don't think we want to say all fundamental representation is mental, because what about representation of T-Rex in a pool of water, or well, T-Rex is a good example, but representation of something in a pool of water before there were any minds, right? There's no that represents, it doesn't represent in virtue of anything else, right? Just in terms of causal relations or some story like that, right? But there's no intentionality there. Mental intentionality there, right? Wouldn't you want to say that's representation, but there's nothing?
No, I wouldn't want to say that's representation.
So the reflection isn't a representation of
No.
the thing?
No, it's a reflection.
Okay.
Not every isomorphism is a representation. The destructive comment is... So it's okay, so you don't want to take the constructive comment, that's fine. So maybe you'll like the destructive one more.
No, but seriously, I would want to hear more later about why you think that's not a representation.
Sure.
That's interesting.
Sure. Okay. So I think you can, at least some of the choice-only sets can be cognized. Here's an example. Suppose it's a subset of the real numbers. Imagine a world where we've got an infinite space, and and we've got some natural way of mapping a line in that infinite space onto the real numbers, say because we've got some distinguished point that we map to 0 and some other distinguished point that we map to 1, and the rest is just linear mapping. Suppose we've got that, and then suppose that all and only the positions corresponding to members of the choice set are occupied by particles in that world. Then a mind can cognize the choice set as the set of all the points, all the real numbers that correspond to occupied points on that line.
So that would help Soames, because if you the possible.
Yeah. So you have a possible finite cognizer who does it with the help of a cooperative physical reality outside her. Now, it gets harder if the cardinalities get bigger than the reals, but maybe there's no cardinality max bound on how large a space-time could be. Maybe it could be infinite dimensional, or who knows?
Yeah, but then that's no, good. No, that's a good. That's a good worry.
Always leave it to Alex to break space-time. Tim?
Just a real quick question of clarification. On the representationalist view of propositions, what typically is it said that necessary falsehoods represent?
What do necessary falsehoods represent? You mean on a cognitive propositions view?
Yeah.
Yeah, he hasn't gotten that far with the. He's still working on basic logical complexity. So yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. That's a good question.
I'm next. Can you go back 2 slides to the argument against CP, I think it was? 3 slides, sorry. So my first thought at premise 4 was, well, Soames thinks that serious actualism sucks, as you quoted him. And so he's not going to be worried that the choice propositions don't exist in alpha, but could still be true in alpha, even though they don't exist in alpha, because he's not a serious actualist. And then I thought, well, they have to exist somewhere, right? And then I thought, well, I could kind of see Soames maybe not thinking that either. Maybe rejecting serious possibilism or something. So maybe that's just too far beyond the pale.
He doesn't know. He knows the argument. He just.
Okay.
Yeah. He was like. He was trying to think of stuff like what Alex was saying.
Okay.
To get out of it. But no, yeah, that's a good. I mean, I see what you mean, because when I was reading his stuff, I was just kind of like, well, where do you draw the line here? Because you could just stop the argument at, okay, like it entails the falsehood of serious actualism. All right, I'm done. This is false. But I just was like, no, let's see how far we can go arguing with him on his own terms. So, but no, I sympathize with where you were going.
Rob Coons?
Yeah, Alex took my question, so I'll switch to a different one. But I think it's related, because I wonder if this argument could be in a way combined with Brian Leftow's. So to create a kind of sort of dilemma for the naturalist, right? So if the naturalist goes with actual things and their powers, right, then they're sort of screwed, right? And if they don't, then they need God to ground all these multi-dimensional worlds that Alex likes. So it's a sort of constructive suggestion.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I'll take it.
I was thinking of actually widening the vision and starting from a different point, and starting from a kind of doctrine of creation. So God, you could think of maybe God, these properties, and God puts them together in a certain order and relation in God's mind, and then God thinks, let that be. And then you get a world with those properties. And then we think the proposition, so that's the proposition, God putting the properties in order. You get the world, gets being, and then we represent, so you can solve then the problem of our representation of the world is by us thinking, putting those same properties before our mind. So you get that problem, you get a handle on that problem. And then there's a lot of other properties God puts before God's mind. And those are the propositions that are possible but not true. So you also get you get an explanation of how propositions themselves could correspond to the states of affairs in the world, the concrete states of affairs, by this doctrine of creation, because they're just when God gives being to that, says let there be, then there's a direct correspondence relation. So I'm thinking of a much larger picture here of that would make it, in my mind at least, more plausible.
So you're thinking of like a combination, like a hybrid theory, where some propositions are God's thoughts, some propositions are human thoughts, because it's the act of
Us putting together and
combining.
Right.
So it sounds like yeah.
And then the possible ones that are true, the necessary ones that are true, or the ones that this is possible. That's what makes that. There's the representation out there, even though no one is thinking of it, is God has those properties put together in God's mind. So you get a lot of different problems solved at the same time, how propositions can kind of correspond to reality, how we are able to grasp the same proposition that God has, as because we just do the same act of putting the properties together. And then how ours correspond because they're structurally the same.
I'm not that much of a scholar of medieval philosophy, but I think what you're saying is very similar to what a lot of medieval philosophers thought about propositions, that there were eternal necessary propositions that were God's thoughts, and then there were the kind of propositions that are our thoughts. And you might think, well, having some sort of a hybrid view helps too with singular propositions about contingent entities. Because it seems like a lot of people want to say those propositions only exist contingently and things like that. So
it helps with correspondence, helps with the doctrine of creation. It's like you're putting them all together.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you'd have to go in for structured propositions if you did that, though, because those propositions will be structured. They'll have like properties and stuff as components, and I might have to change the trajectory of my research career if I did that. But that's okay.
All right. Thanks, guys, for being creatively constructive in your comments.